So it's time for me to return to the Egyptian Heaven and Hell by E.A. Wallis Budge. And let me remind you that this is what I have in my hand is a reprint of the 1905 text. That was in 3 volumes. So volume 3 is the contents of the books and the contents of the books of the other world described and compared. And so the scene from the papyrus of Necht, showing the deceased and his wife worshipping Osiris, Yasur, in the other world, and the manner of the house in which they expect to live, and their vineyard and garden with its lake of water. British Museum, number 10, 471, sheet 21. And so what else is going on there? And what does it mean? The present work is the outcome of 2 lectures. This is the preface, by the way. The present work is the outcome of 2 lectures on the books of the Duat, the Egyptian underworld, or otherworld, which I had the honor to deliver at the Royal Institution in the spring of 1904. It has been prepared at the suggestion of many who wish to continue their inquiries into the beliefs of the ancient Egyptians concerning the abode of the departed and the state of the blessed and the damned. The objects of all the books of the other world was to provide the dead with a guide or handbook which contained a description of the regions through which their souls would have to pass on their way to the kingdom of Osiris, Yasur, or to that portion of the sky where the sun rose, and which would supply them with the words of power and magical names necessary for making an unimpeded journey from this world to the abode of the blessed. Remember, a lot of people knew about these things before they died, so in a way they could have been preparing. Some people just said at my funeral, but I'm sure some people prepared their whole lives. For a period of 2,000 years, in the history of Egypt, the books of the other world consisted of text only. But for about BCE 2500, funeral artists began to represent pictorially the chief features of the Field of Peace or the Islands of the Blessed, and before the close of the 19th dynasty, about 1300 years later, all the principal books related to the Duat were profusely illustrated. And remember, the Osiris myth, the sort of idea of him taking over the underworld, kind of 2800 BCE, actually. In the copies of those that were painted on the walls of royal tombs, each division of the Duat was clearly drawn and described, and each gate with all its guardians was carefully depicted. Both the living and the dead could learn from them not only the names, but also the forms of every entity, spirit, soul, shade, demon, and monster. And when I say God, I probably mean here that when they're saying God, they probably mean a demon. But powers, entities, and monster which they were likely to meet on their way. And the copious texts which were given side by side with the pictures enabled the traveler through the Duat, always, of course, provided that he had learned them, to participate in the benefits which were decreed by the sun entity, Yef, for the beings in each section of it. In the primitive times, each great city of Egypt possessed its own other world, and no doubt the priest of each city provided the worshippers of their entities with suitable guides to the abode of its dead. In the beginning of the dynastic period, however, we find that the cult of Osiris was extremely popular, and therefore it was only natural that the great numbers of people in all parts of Egypt should hope and believe that their souls after death would go to the kingdom in the other world over which he reigned. The beliefs connected with the occult of Osiris, Yasir, developed naturally out of the beliefs of the pre-dynastic Egyptians, who we have every reason to think dealt largely in magic, both black and white. Well, yes and no. Magic is an active part of one's spiritual life, the art and science of religion. Most definitely, every culture did. And Christians like to say, "Oh, these other people, magic. Oh, the Quran, that's Arab magic." Well, not Arab. Sihr. Sihr was a different matter, and the ancient Egyptians talked about sihr. So, many of the superstitions and most of the fantastic and half-savage ideas about the entities and the spiritual powers enshrined in the great collection of the religious text called 3.1 were inherited by the dynastic Egyptians. Horus, and Temple of Horus, House of Horus, more or less, were inherited by the dynastic Egyptians from some of the oldest dwellers in the Nile Valley. Remember, the Egyptian civilization southwest, they found their origins. But that culture at one point spread clear across through Timbuktu over to Mauritania and the Eye of the Sahara, and Atlantis was the mythical founder of the Berber kingdom, and genetically and otherwise we have the link. And when the Sahara shrunk, but anyways, those who died in the faith of Osiris believed in the efficiency of the book of Per-Mharu, which were content to employ it as a guide to heaven, which was full of material delights. The number of those who were the followers of Osiris was very large under every dynasty in Egypt, and there was annunciation, and pretty much everything you're going to see in the Christian myth you're going to find somewhere about Osiris. Employed as a guide to heaven, full of material delights, a number of whom were followers of Osiris, Yasir, were very large under every dynasty in Egypt. On the other hand, from the 4th dynasty onwards, there was a very large class who had no belief in a purely material heaven. And this being so, it is not surprising that the books of the other world contain the expression of their views should be composed. The principal books of the underworld in vogue under the 18th and the 19th dynasties were Per-Mharu, or the Book of Coming Forth by Day, Shat and Yimduat, or the Book of That which is in the Duat. The composition to which the name the Book of Gates has been given, now the first of these, which is commonly known as the Theban recension of the Book of the Dead, has supplied us with much valuable information about the beliefs which flourished in connection with an earlier form of the ancient cult of Yasir in the Delta, and with the later form of his worship, after he'd clearly absorbed the position and attributes of Khnti Yimte, an old local deity of the Abydos. Well, a lot of these absorbing and making oneness is like it was one the whole time, and people have these different things, ideas of divinity, and we don't have to think of them as separate, but that's one of the things that happen. The two other books, however, are as important, each in its own way, as the Book of the Dead, for they throw considerable light. They throw considerable light on the development of the material and the spiritual elements in the religion of Egypt and commemorate the belief in the existence of the numbers of primitive entities who are unknown outside these books. Well, the jinn predate the humans, but does that mean that humans are advanced because humans are newer? I don't think it works that way. Who are unknown outside these books. The book Yim Duat, in the form of which we now know it, was drawn up by the priest of the confraternity of Yemen Ra at Thebes, with the express object of demonstrating that their entity was the overlord over all the divinities, and the supreme power in Pet Ta Duat are, as we should say, heaven, earth, and hell. The Duat, or otherworld, in which they imagined included the Duat of every great district of Egypt, viz. The Duat of Ante Yemente at Abydos, the Duat of Seker at Memphis, the Duat of Osiris at Mendes, and the Duat of Temu Kheper Ra of Heliopolis. In the book Yim Duat, the entity Yemen Ra was made to pass through all these Duats as their overlord and god, and his priests taught that all the other gods of the dead, including Osiris, lived through his words, and that such refreshing as the beings of the Duat enjoyed each day was due to the grace and light during his passage through the regions and circles. So everybody, what they worship, the chief of what they worship, they make it as the chief god. Some people as themselves, because that's actually what's going on. It's about your journey through, and so people kind of seeing themselves as Yemen Ra, but again, you don't have to worship yourself to kind of understand how this goes on. But moreover, according to the dogmas of the priest of Yemen Ra, only those who were fortunate enough to secure a place in the divine bark of the entity could hope to traverse the Duat unharmed, and only those who were his elect had the certainty of being reborn daily. Well, it's through your own beliefs and actions that you become of the elect, right? With a new supply of strength and life, and of becoming of like nature and substance with him. Al-Wadud, I am loving. Al-Hakim, for such I will be wise. That sort of thing. In the Book of the Gates, the dogmas and doctrines of Osiris were far more prominent, and the state which beatified closely resembles that described in the Book of the Dead. In primitive times in Egypt, men thought that they would obtain admission into the kingdom of Hathep by learning and remembering the secret name of this entity and certainly magical formula, and by pronouncing them in the correct way at the proper time. The need for a consciousness of sin and repentance and a life of good works were not then held to be indispensable for admission into the abode of the beatified. From the Book of the Gates, however, we learn that in the latter dynastic period a belief was prevalent that those who worshipped the great entity on earth and made all duly appointed offerings and turned not aside to miserable little gods, false gods, great god, false god, and lived according to Ma'at, truth, A.E., uprightness and integrity, and would receive a good reward because they had done these things. The text in these books state that the beatified live forever in the kingdom of Osiris, Yesir, and feed daily upon the heavenly wheat of righteousness, that springs from the body of Yasur, which is eternal. He is righteousness itself, and they are righteousness, and they are to live by eating the body of their God daily. You know, the Christian sacrament, it used to be available as much as 6 times a day. I don't even have any idea where that's available even in a Catholic church. But wheat, other areas, it was other grains that were used, but the Christian myth derives from the Egyptian myth most strongly, and dying daily, as St. Paul said. On the other hand, the wicked, i.e., those who did not believe in the great God or make offerings, are hacked to pieces by the divine messenger of wrath, and their bodies, souls, and spirits are consumed by fire once and for all. So, this developed idea that we're not going to accept naturally, that we're going to have to be kind of led towards in a matter of steps, they're threatening us. They're threatening us, saying, oh, you're going to get the worst, the worst of what happens on earth. It's going to be multiplied to you again and again and again. It's going to happen to you there because you didn't accept our path. And, people fall for it. I was raised to believe that sort of mythology. I read the Bible 21 times before abandoning it. Clear through. And now I'm copying it through, and I believe in the truth of it better than ever, now that I'm not into this polytheism. And I notice its problems, and I don't believe in that sort of thing. The Egyptians had no belief in a purgatory. Well, I guess you could say, I think there were some that did. The fires of the other world were, it is true, occupied daily in burning up the damned and the opponents of the sun entity, but each day brought its own supply of bodies, souls, spirits, demons for annihilation. Etc. In all the books of the other world, we find pits of fire, abysses of darkness, murderous knives, streams of boiling water, foul stenches, fiery serpents, hideous animal-headed monsters, and creatures and cruel death-dwelling beings of various shapes, etc., similar to those which were familiar in the early Christian and medieval literature. Medieval, be how it was pronounced at some point. Medieval, but we simplified it to medieval literature, and it's tolerably certain that modern nations are indebted to Egypt for many of their conceptions of hell. Are, pointing at Egypt, just like America and France with its white bread and harsh perfumes. But there's good stuff that America got for France. We would have our country work as it was. If France wasn't in the middle, we don't think that would have been the case. In the present work, the object has been to give the reader the complete hieroglyphic text of the Book of the Yom Dewat and the Book of the Gates, with reproductions of all their illustrations in black and white, and English translations and descriptions. The illustrations of the former work have been specially traced from the place of the excellent edition of the Tomb of Seti I, published by M.M.G. Lefebvre U. Bourriant V. Loret and E. Naville. Is that how you say it? And the second volume of Memoirs de la Mission Archéologique Francis au Caire, Paris, 1886. Forgive me if I did not say the French right. I don't quite remember at the moment. The illustrations of the Book of the Gates has been traced from Benami's sarcophagus of Oymen Eptha 1, London 1864, but for certain scenes I was permitted by the late Mr. G. Birch, keeper of Sir John Soane's maybe, museum. I know there's the Sloane part of the British Museum, to compare the tracings with the scenes of the sarcophagus itself. A copy of the scene on the portion of the cover which I acquired for the trustees of the British Museum a few years ago has also been included. The plan followed has been to devote a chapter to each division of the Duat and give the hieroglyphic text with short descriptions of the various entities and etc., and translations as near to the scenes which they refer as possible. With a view to making the edition as complete as possible, I've included a transcript of the summary of the Book of the Yom Duat from Dr. Pleit's facsimile of the Leyden Papyrus. Is the Leyden Papyrus the one where the guy... No. The Leyden Papyrus is like a book of spells, right? And a translation for the convenience of the reader who may wish to compare the divisions of the Yom Duat with those of the Book of Gates. The former has been printed in one volume and the latter in another. The full index given at the end of the introductory volume will, it is hoped, make reference and comparison easy. All general descriptions and such explanations of the scenes are possible in the present state of our knowledge, have been given in a series of chapters in this volume, together with an account of the origin and development of guides to the other world, and a rendering of a recently published and very important text from a coffin at Cairo. The text proves that the Egyptians believed in the reconstitution of family life in the other world, and thought that every man and woman and child would possess such a measure of individuality that they would know their relatives and friends in the other world, and would be known by them. See within chapter 3. The first translation of the book Yom Duat was published by Professor G. Maspero in the Revenu des Religions, 1888, tome 17, page 251 to 310, tome 18, page 1, so tome 18 and tome 17, tome 18, page 1 through 67. This has been reprinted with certain modifications and additions in his Bibliothèque Egyptologique, tome 2, page 1 through 181. Paris, Paris, 1893. The text chosen by him for elucidation was that published by M.G. Lefebvre in his edition of the Tomb of Seti I, and this he supplemented with extracts from other versions of the work given on sarcophagi, papyri, etc. The summary or short form of the book Yom Duat was first published in complete form with variant readings by M.G. Jacquer in his Le Livre de Quel ye Adans Pahedi Paris, 1894. In Professor Maspero's work mentioned above, he also discussed and analyzed earlier sections of the Book of the Gates, which M.E. Lefebvre published a translation of the text as found on the sarcophagus of Seti I and the Records of the Past, volume 10, page 79 through 134, London 1878, and volumes 12, page 1 through 35, London 1881. In preparing for the present edition of the two great books of the other world, I have availed myself of these works, and also the valued editions of the text from the royal tombs at Thebes, which M.E. Lefebvre has published in the first of the second fasciculi of the third volume of the Memoirs de la Mission Archéologique Française au Caire, Paris, 1889. E. Wallis Budge, given in London, October 1905. And so there's going to be an after this, I guess. So there'll be 15 sections to this. This is just number 1.